Today, we're going to talk about what happens when an entire nation's pantry just runs bare. We're taking a trip back to the Great Depression to really unpack a story that's often overlooked. A story of hunger, incredible ingenuity, and ultimately survival, all told through the food that people managed to put on their tables. This one sentence just hits you. It really cuts to the heart of it all. For millions of people, the stock market crash wasn't some abstract headline. No, it became a very real, very personal problem. How in the world am I going to fill a plate today?
We hear a lot about the economics and the politics of the Great Depression, but what we're going to do here is pull back the curtain on the quiet, daily struggle that was happening in kitchens and in breadlines all across the country.
So you have to wonder, how did it all happen so fast? How did America go from the roaring 20s to a decade of sheer scarcity seemingly overnight? Let's break it down.
It was really a perfect storm. Unemployment just skyrocketed, which meant families had zero cash for groceries. And at the exact same time, the Dust Bowl was devastating farms. So suddenly, that basic rhythm of life, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that wasn't a guarantee anymore. It was a luxury.
For the people who had absolutely nothing left, survival became a public affair. And the most iconic and frankly heartbreaking image of this entire era, it has to be the soup kitchen breadline.
Just try to imagine this routine. You're waiting for hours, maybe in the freezing cold, for what was probably going to be your only meal of the entire day. You get a piece of bread, some watery soup, maybe a cup of coffee. But the thing is, people weren't just swallowing soup here, they were swallowing their pride.
And this really gets to the psychological damage. It wasn't just about an empty stomach. It was a daily fight with shame for people who, not long before, had been proud providers for their families. All right, so let's shift from those public lines to the private war that was being fought inside every American home. This is where desperation and creativity really collided. The name of the game was stretching. The goal was to create the illusion of a full meal from almost nothing. So, a little bit of milk was watered down to fill a few glasses. A flavorful soup was diluted with water to make it last just one more day. It was this constant balancing act between what you wished you had and what you actually had.
And this is where the ingenuity just gets wild. Okay, so apples were a total luxury, right? So people invented mock apple pie using soda crackers, sugar, and spices to try and mimic the taste and texture. Hoover stew was basically a thin soup made with whatever you could find, often just some canned tomatoes and maybe a few slices of hot dog. These recipes weren't about taste, they were about pure, desperate resourcefulness.
And that right there is the core principle of it all. Every scrap, every potato peel, every tiny leftover was saved and used for something else. The whole point of cooking completely shifted. It wasn't about making something delicious, it was about making something, anything, that would stop that gnawing feeling of hunger.
Now here's the thing. This experience didn't just magically end when the economy started to recover. It left these deep psychological scars on an entire generation of Americans.
Just think about that for a second. For kids who grew up during this time, that constant anxiety about where the next meal was coming from, well, it became a fundamental part of how they saw the world. It was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And it's really important to remember that not everyone's struggle looked the same. Out on the farms, families could at least try to grow their own vegetables or maybe keep a few chickens for eggs. They could barter with their neighbors. But in the cities, man, the options were so much more limited. It often came down to charity or, in the worst cases, searching through trash for scrap. So when we say that this daily fight for food actually shaped a generation, what does that really mean? How did it change people's actual behavior for the rest of their lives?
Well, that deep-seated anxiety hardened into lifelong habits. Survivors of the Depression were famously frugal. They obsessively saved leftovers. They absolutely despised waste. And many of them cooked those simple, frugal meals for decades, even long after they could afford much more. They just could never shake that fear of an empty pantry.
For an entire generation, the whole relationship with food was just fundamentally reset. It wasn't about comfort or pleasure or community. It was just fuel. It was about survival.
And that kind of leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? When you really understand their struggle with scarcity, it forces you to look at our own world, a world of almost unbelievable abundance. Their lesson was about survival. So, what can their story teach us today about our own relationship with food, with what we buy, and with what we throw away?